Imagine waking to the smell of rot, the metallic sting of fear, and the hollow echo of laughter that belongs not to joy, but to cruelty. A man lies shackled in darkness, his body bound by iron, yet his mind, sharp, defiant, stays in horror. Before him, the body of his wife, cold, motionless, her eyes staring at nothing, yet somehow demanding attention. Around him, shadows shift, faces illuminated by torchlight, yet twisted in derision, watching. They are not strangers. They are the men and women who were once his servants, his confidants, his slaves. In this hour, all roles invert. The world he knew, the rules he trusted, collapse into a grotesque theater of suffering. The chains bite his wrists, but the real prison is not metal, it is knowledge. He knows too much. He has lived in truth, and now truth has returned like a blade, cutting and laughing at his vulnerability. This is not a story whispered in history books. It is a secret buried under the comforting lies of civilization, the sanitized tales of morality and order. In 1832, in a remote corner of the American South, one man became the unwilling witness to the darkest reflection of power and perversion. His life, his love, his loyalty, all instruments to a macabre experiment of authority. The slaves, conditioned for obedience, were suddenly the arbiters of his torment. Their laughter was not mindless. It was a lesson written in blood, a mirror showing what happens when power is denied to the rightful heir and given instead to those society has told him to command. And yet, there is more beneath the surface. This is not merely an act of cruelty. It is an orchestration of control, a demonstration that knowledge, even love, is meaningless under the eyes of those who dictate the rules. Every man has his chains. Some are forged from iron, others from lies, fear, and unspoken societal codes. He felt both. In the flickering torchlight, he understood that the world he believed in, the structures that promised safety, were illusions. The real architecture of life is built from submission, deception, and hidden desires masked as justice. And tonight, all of it would be laid bare. Because the lesson is not only for him, it is for any man who dares to see beyond the curtain. What you are about to hear, what you are about to witness, is forbidden knowledge. And once it touches your mind, there is no retaining. Are you ready to see the machinery of control, the hidden appetites of the powerful, the twisted games played in the shadows? If so, step closer. The darkness is patient, and it watches you now. The night was alive with whispers, not of the wind, but of unspoken commands and unseen hierarchies, echoing through the crumbling walls of the plantation like a pulse of hidden power. The man's eyes, wide with disbelief, traced the faces of those who had once obeyed him without question, now liberated from obedience yet enslaved to something far darker. Pleasure in domination, the intoxicating thrill of rewriting the rules of life and death. Every flicker of torchlight revealed a truth most dare not speak. Fear is the ultimate teacher, and when wielded by those society has denied, it becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. He realized, in a shudder that coursed through his very bones, that chains are not always physical. They are etched into the mind, imposed by belief, loyalty, and the illusions of morality. His wife, whose life had once been intertwined with his own in the quiet rhythm of love, now served as the grotesque centerpiece of a lesson he could neither negotiate nor escape. And yet, he noticed something in the eyes of the crowd, something that chilled him more than the cold clasp of iron. In their laughter, he saw envy, curiosity, and the first whispers of power's most dangerous trait, imitation. This was not mere rebellion, it was the birth of a new order, where the powerless, once invisible, could manipulate the visible, bend morality to spectacle, and play with the essence of life itself. The man's heart pounded, for he understood that this display was only the surface. Beneath it lay systems of control older than the plantation, older than any law or religion he had ever trusted, hidden in plain sight, encoded in rituals of obedience, reward, and punishment. And as he struggled against his chains, he understood a terrifying certainty. Those who believe themselves masters are often the most vulnerable when their constructs fail, and those who were once considered slaves are the most dangerous when they awaken to truth. Tonight was no accident. It was a demonstration, a warning, a revelation, and the first step down a path that few dare walk. And as the laughter continued, as the shadows danced across his wife's lifeless face, the man realized this was not about punishment. It was about awakening. And he, like the viewer now leaning closer to this story, was about to understand just how deep the machinery of power and psychological control truly runs. The air was thick with a tension that no candlelight could pierce, a suffocating reminder that in this world, knowledge is a double-edged blade, sharp enough to cut your enemies, yet capable of carving your own flesh if mishandled. The man's mind raced, grappling with the impossible. Every detail, every shadow, every whisper around him was deliberate, orchestrated, like a symphony of cruelty designed by unseen hands. He understood, with a sickening clarity, that this was not a moment of chaos but of design, a lesson embedded in human behavior, rehearsed over decades, perhaps centuries. The slaves who surrounded him were actors, but also students and teachers in a system far larger than their understanding, a hidden curriculum of domination, fear, and psychological mastery. Each laugh, each step, each glance was coded with meaning, demonstrating how easily loyalty can be inverted, how obedience can be transformed into power when the rules are twisted by the unseen elite. And in that realization came the most terrifying truth. What he had believed was love, morality, and justice were merely illusions, carefully constructed to pacify the masses while true authority operated in shadows. His wife's death, horrific and final, was not simply an act of violence. It was a symbol, a message that even those closest to you can be weaponized, manipulated, and displayed to teach obedience to forces beyond comprehension. He felt rage and despair clash violently within him, but also a darker curiosity, a need to understand, to penetrate the veiled systems that governed not only this plantation, but all institutions, all hierarchies, all societies built on secrecy and hidden agendas. The crowd watched, but they were also being watched, instruments in a chain that stretched far beyond that single night. And in that chain, he saw the reflection of every man, including the viewer now listening. The structures that shape our thoughts, our fears, our loyalties, are seldom what they seem. The manipulation is subtle, woven into education, culture, religion, and law, so that the moment we realize it, it has already shaped our choices. The man clenched his fists, his mind aflame with understanding. The horror of his situation was absolute, but so was the revelation. To survive in this world, one must recognize the hidden forces, the unseen hierarchies, the invisible chains, and learn to walk the darkness without being consumed by it. And that is the first truth of forbidden knowledge. It is dangerous not because it is false, but because it is real. And once you see it, nothing in your life will ever feel secure again. Today, as the night dragged on, the man began to notice patterns in the chaos, subtle signals that had been invisible until now. The way the slaves' movements mirrored each other, the cadence of their laughter timed with the flicker of torchlight, the almost imperceptible gestures that signaled approval or derision. Each detail was a fragment of a larger design, a code embedded in human behavior that had existed long before this plantation, long before this country, long before the man had even been born. He realized with chilling clarity that what he was witnessing was a microcosm of power itself, the constant, unseen manipulation of those who believe they are free, the strategic shaping of fear and desire to maintain control over every action, every thought. The laughter, once grotesque and mocking, began to make sense. It was instruction. It was a lesson for those who watched him, and for him, if he could survive it. He saw that the slaves, empowered in this moment, were merely vessels for a deeper game, one in which understanding the rules was more dangerous than ignorance, and obedience could become a weapon as potent as rebellion. And then he saw her, his wife, not as a woman, but as a symbol, a tool of the system, a representation of the fragility of human attachment when subjected to the machinery of domination. In her lifeless form lay the ultimate message. No bond, no love, no trust could escape the architecture of hidden authority. Every man, every society, every hierarchy was built on similar principles, unseen but omnipresent. The orchestration of perception, the control of belief, the shaping of behavior through subtle, relentless pressure. He understood that his suffering was intentional, a lesson that transcended punishment. It was awakening. To endure it, he had to detach, to observe, to see the invisible threads that connected every action, every choice, every moment of terror. And as he did, a paradox emerged. The more he understood, the more power he could claim, but the more isolated he became, suspended between comprehension and horror. A man who had glimpsed the true mechanics of domination and could never unsee them. The night pressed on, heavy and unyielding, and the man, chained, surrounded, and humiliated, felt a strange clarity settle over him. The world is not governed by law or morality, but by those who understand the secret structures, who can manipulate perception, fear, and desire with precision. And in that revelation lay both salvation and damnation. For once you see the game, you cannot return to innocence. You can only play, or be destroyed. In the dim light of the torches, he began to see the architecture of control not as isolated cruelty, but as a systematic design that had been refined over generations. Every glance, every smack, every jeer of the crowd was a lesson in authority, obedience, and the fragility of human pride. The man realized that the true horror was not in his chains or his wife's body. It was in the revelation that power is invisible, fluid, and mercilessly adaptive. Those who seem weak, those who are deemed servants, often hold the most potent influence when they awaken to hidden truths. The slave's laughter, once merely a torment, now revealed itself as a ritual, a training ground for those who understood the subtle manipulations of hierarchy. They were learning the art of domination in real time, absorbing the lesson that fear, knowledge, and spectacle could be weaponized together to bend reality itself. And the man, bound, exposed, shattered, became both teacher and subject, caught in a paradoxical role that threatened to destroy his mind even as it sharpened it. He understood now that institutions, societies, and even families operate on similar principles, hiding their levers of control behind the comforting facades of law, tradition, and morality. The lesson of that night, brutal and obscene, was a mirror held to every man's life. Obedience can be extracted, loyalty can be subverted, and even love can be used to manipulate, control, and dominate. And yet, within the terror, a flicker of opportunity emerged. Knowledge, even forbidden, carries power. To see the machinery behind the performance, to recognize the coded gestures and orchestrated cruelty, is the first step toward mastery. He could either succumb to despair, allowing the system to consume him, or he could internalize the lesson, understanding that the rules that govern fear and obedience are universal, timeless, and manipulable, if one has the courage to act. And in that realization, the night became both prison and classroom, cruelty and revelation, horror and enlightenment. The man felt a shift within himself, a subtle awakening, as if the chains around his wrists were teaching him a language older than words, a knowledge older than memory. For those who dare to look, the hidden structures of power are never subtle. They are brutal, direct, and impossible to ignore. And as the torchlight flickered across his wife's lifeless form, he understood the final, terrifying truth. The system is indifferent, but those who comprehend it gain the ability to move within it, unseen, untouchable, and unstoppable. The man's mind, once tangled in disbelief and anguish, now began to dissect the scene with a ruthless clarity. Every movement, every laugh, every subtle expression of the slaves around him was part of an intricate, almost ritualistic code, a code he had unknowingly been blind to his entire life. He realized that power does not reside in the strongest fist or the harshest decree. It resides in the unseen, in the knowledge that shapes perception, fear, and desire before a word is spoken. The bodies around him, once instruments of obedience, had become instruments of instruction, showing that liberation is only as dangerous as the wisdom to wield it. And in that, he saw a reflection of the world itself, nations, religions, corporations, families, all structured to appear orderly, yet all secretly governed by invisible mechanisms, by rituals and lessons whispered in shadows, shaping loyalty, twisting morality, and bending the human will. His wife's death, grotesque and unyielding, was a centerpiece, a horrifying metaphor for the way innocence and love are manipulated, sacrificed, and displayed to reinforce obedience and fear. And yet, amid the horror, a subtle thread of awakening pulled at him, a dangerous, intoxicating truth. Understanding the system is the first step toward controlling it, but only if the mind can endure the weight of that knowledge. He felt his perception shift, a lens sharpening over a world previously masked by lies, illusions, and convenient narratives. The laughter that had tormented him began to speak in a language he could understand, a dialect of power, authority, and control that had existed for centuries. And with each revelation, the man felt a transformation. The chains that bound his body became less significant than the mental chains he had begun to recognize in himself and others. He understood that most men live their entire lives oblivious to these forces, guided by invisible hands, shaped without consent, and broken without awareness. But he, in his suffering, had been offered a glimpse behind the veil. And now, as the torches flickered and shadows danced across the scene of devastation, he knew that the lesson was far from over. Every man listening to this story, every man who seeks mastery over life rather than submission to it, must confront the same terrifying truths. The rules are invisible, the teachers are merciless, and the awakening is painful, unavoidable, and irreversible. The deeper he stared into the faces around him, the more he began to notice the invisible hierarchies at play, subtle yet absolute, guiding every gesture, every expression, every breath. Power, he realized, was not in domination alone. It was in observation, in the ability to see the hidden rules, the unspoken contracts, the silent rewards and punishments that orchestrate behavior without a single word. The slave's laughter, once a torment, became a curriculum in human manipulation, a textbook written in fear and curiosity, in envy and revelation. He saw how obedience could be twisted into empowerment, how the powerless could learn to command when they understood the patterns that governed life itself. And yet, the lesson was as cruel as it was enlightening. To comprehend is to isolate, to awaken is to suffer, and to see clearly is to know that most of the world operates blindly, bound by invisible chains that only the brave, or the damned, can perceive. His wife's body, the horrific centerpiece of the night, became a symbol of how attachment, love, and morality could be weaponized, dissected, and displayed to enforce conformity. He understood now that every institution he had trusted, family, religion, government, society itself, operated on the same principles, encoding obedience into behavior while masking the rules behind comfort, ritual, and tradition. And as he felt the cold bite of iron around his wrists, he realized that true freedom, true mastery, required understanding these forces, internalizing their logic, and learning to operate within them without succumbing to despair. Knowledge, he saw, was a double-edged sword. It could liberate, but it could also shatter, revealing truths that the unprepared mind cannot endure. And yet, in the shadows of that horrifying night, in the grotesque theater of suffering, he glimpsed the path forward, a way to see the world as it truly is, stripped of illusions, stripped of false morality, and illuminated by the brutal light of truth. The moment of awakening was terrifying, intoxicating, and absolute, and he understood that those who ignored it were doomed to live and die as instruments of forces they could neither name nor resist. For any man willing to see, the lesson was clear. The machinery of control is everywhere, invisible yet unrelenting, and mastery begins the moment one recognizes the patterns and dares to navigate them consciously. Even in the face of horror, the man's awareness expanded, and with it came a chilling comprehension. The chaos surrounding him was not random, nor merely a punishment. It was education, a brutal initiation into the mechanics of control that had always existed, hidden in plain sight. Every glance from the slaves, every snicker that cut through the night air, was a lesson in hierarchy, perception, and the manipulation of fear. He saw how easily loyalty could be twisted into rebellion, how obedience could become a weapon for those who knew the rules, and how the powerless, when awakened, could impose authority over the seemingly powerful. His wife's lifeless form, displayed as both spectacle and warning, revealed another truth that gnawed at his consciousness. Human attachment, love, morality, they are all tools in the hands of those who understand the subtle levers of behavior. And the lesson was universal, stretching beyond this plantation, beyond this night, beyond the boundaries of life itself. The structures we trust are built to conceal their true mechanisms, shaping decisions, desires, and fears without consent. He felt a dangerous clarity settle in him, the kind that isolates as it enlightens, the kind that marks a man forever changed. The night, once an arena of torment, had become a classroom of forbidden knowledge, and as he traced the torchlight across the faces around him, he realized the terrifying truth. Most men live their lives oblivious to these forces, bound by invisible chains of expectation and tradition, incapable of perceiving the mechanisms that govern their every action. But he, shackled, humiliated, and staring into the grotesque theater of human behavior, had glimpsed it all. And now the choice lay before him, as it does before every man who dares to awaken, succumb to despair, to submission, to the machinery of control, or rise, armed with the knowledge that most fear to see, and learn to navigate the world with eyes wide open, aware of the forces that shape thought, loyalty, and desire. This is the moment the system fears, the moment the indoctrinated call dangerous, the moment only a few can endure, when a man sees clearly and refuses to be a pawn. And in that horrifying, intoxicating instant, the man understood that awakening is both a curse and a weapon, a liberation and a burden, and once glimpsed, the world can never be viewed through ignorance again. As the night stretched, a deeper pattern emerged, one that was invisible to those who merely obeyed and terrifyingly clear to him who dared to observe. He began to see the subtle choreography in the slaves' movements, the almost imperceptible signals exchanged in glances and gestures, each one teaching obedience, rebellion, and perception simultaneously. Every laugh, every mockery directed at him, was not only punishment but instruction, a curriculum of domination, a blueprint of human control written in the shadows of Fey. And in that realization, he understood the most unsettling truth of all. Power is rarely absolute. It is fluid, invisible, and transferred to those who comprehend its hidden language. The same lesson applied to every system, every institution, every society, governments, families, religions, all designed to appear orderly, moral, and just, while secretly operating through fear, perception management, and unspoken rules. His wife's death, grotesque and final, became more than tragedy. It was a symbol of how attachment, loyalty, and love can be manipulated to enforce control, to demonstrate consequence, to awaken, or crush, the mind. And yet, amid the horror, he felt a dangerous exhilaration, the clarity of seeing the machinery at work, the understanding of the invisible chains that bind men, and the knowledge that the rules are not fixed. They can be deciphered, anticipated, and navigated by those with eyes wide open. He realized that the truly powerful are not those who strike, but those who see, who anticipate, and who know the levers of influence that bend the behavior of others without ever touching them. The night had become a revelation, a twisted classroom, and he, the condemned, the humiliated, was both student and witness, gaining forbidden understanding in the midst of grotesque spectacle. And as he processed this, a subtle shift occurred within him. Fear remained, yes, but it became a tool, a lens, a force to calibrate perception and sharpen strategy. This was the moment where knowledge transforms from passive awareness into power, where comprehension becomes a weapon. And for the first time, he sensed that survival, influence, and mastery were possible, even here, in this grotesque theater of cruelty. But he also understood that the awakening is perilous, isolating, and irreversible. Once a man sees these structures, the world of comfortable illusions is forever shattered, replaced by the stark, dangerous clarity of truth. Why now? The man's senses were fully awake, his mind stretching into territories few dare to explore. He saw that the spectacle around him, the laughter, the chains, the corpse of his wife, was merely the surface of a far deeper, more insidious system. It was a language of control older than any law, older than the plantation itself, written into human behavior, ritual, and hierarchy. Every reaction, every glance, every murmur of approval or contempt was a cipher, a test, a lesson in manipulation and perception. The slaves, liberated in appearance, had become instruments of instruction, demonstrating that power is not always granted. It is learned, seized, and executed with subtle precision. And the most horrifying truth struck him. The structures that claim to protect, to guide, and to moralize are often merely veneers masking invisible forces that operate relentlessly, shaping loyalty, fear, and desire in ways the unobservant cannot perceive. His wife's death, once a private tragedy, now revealed itself as a deliberate symbol, a demonstration of how attachment, morality, and love can be weaponized by those who understand the hidden mechanics of influence. And in that recognition, a dangerous transformation began. Terror shifted into comprehension, despair became strategic awareness, and humiliation became a lens through which he could see the rules behind the performance. The night had become a lesson not only in cruelty but in mastery, showing that to endure, a man must observe, analyze, and adapt. He realized that most men live blind, following illusions of morality and law, unaware that the true forces guiding life are subtle, invisible, and implacable. But he had seen the machinery. He had glimpsed the architecture of control, the invisible scripts that govern action, thought, and loyalty, and that knowledge, forbidden and perilous, became a tool. Yet with understanding came isolation. The awakened are often alone, marked by clarity that others fear, unable to share it without being misunderstood or destroyed. And in that realization, he grasped the final, terrifying truth of the night. The world is not what it seems, morality is often performance, and survival belongs only to those who perceive the invisible currents and learn to navigate them. And for the first time, he understood that seeing is a weapon, and once a man wields it, he can never return to ignorance. The man's awareness now stretched beyond the immediate horror, beyond the grotesque tableau of his wife's lifeless body and the gleeful faces surrounding him. He began to perceive the invisible scaffolding beneath it all, the subtle rules, coded signals, and hidden hierarchies that dictated behavior, orchestrated fear, and manipulated perception with ruthless precision. Every movement, every laugh, every look was part of a complex curriculum in control, a blueprint for domination that had been refined over centuries. And he understood, with a shiver that shook him to his core, that the chains he felt on his wrists were insignificant compared to the chains woven into the human mind, the invisible constraints of expectation, tradition, loyalty, and conditioned obedience. His wife's death, brutal and symbolic, became the ultimate lesson. Attachment, morality, and love are not shields. They are instruments, tools to be wielded by those who understand the machinery of influence. And yet, within the terror, a spark of empowerment ignited. Knowledge, even forbidden, carries power, and understanding the invisible patterns of human behavior transforms victimhood into agency. He could see now that the very institutions he had trusted, family, religion, law, society, functioned on the same principles, hiding manipulation beneath comfort, ritual, and moral posturing. And as he watched the slaves, once his subordinates, now wield authority through understanding, he realized the ultimate lesson. Power is never fixed. It flows to those who comprehend its language, anticipate its shifts, and exploit its weaknesses. But with this awakening came a heavier truth. Awareness isolates. To see clearly is to be suspended between comprehension and horror, to understand the mechanisms that govern life while others remain blind, oblivious, and obedient. And he felt the burden of that clarity pressing on him, a weight heavier than any iron shackle. For any man who dares to awaken to such truths, the path is perilous. The world will never appear the same, morality will seem performative, and survival depends not on strength or courage alone, but on the ability to navigate the invisible currents that control thought, loyalty, and desire. And as he lingered in the darkness, surrounded by orchestrated cruelty and the gleaming eyes of the awakened, he realized that the night was not an ending. It was an initiation, a gateway into forbidden knowledge that few can endure, but that transforms forever those who survived. Why now? The man's mind had sharpened into a terrifying clarity, seeing the hidden architecture behind every action, every reaction, every suppressed instinct. The night had transformed from mere horror into a demonstration of principles older than law, older than nations, older than civilization itself. He realized that the slaves, whose laughter and mockery had tormented him, were not simply acting. They were embodying the rules of power, showing him how control shifts to those who understand the invisible levers of influence. Each gesture, each subtle exchange of glances, was a coded language, a curriculum of domination and perception, and he understood that every system, every institution, every hierarchy he had ever known functioned according to the same hidden code. His wife's death became more than tragedy. It was a grotesque lesson in attachment and morality, a symbol that love and loyalty are tools to be manipulated, tested, and displayed to enforce obedience or awaken comprehension. And in that moment, a dangerous exhilaration surged within him. The chains on his wrists, the humiliation, the spectacle of cruelty. It was all a mirror reflecting a universal truth. Knowledge is power, but forbidden knowledge is a weapon, and to wield it requires endurance, courage, and detachment. He saw that most men live unaware, bound by invisible chains of expectation, ritual, and conditioned loyalty, unable to perceive the machinery operating relentlessly behind their lives. But he had glimpsed it, and once seen, the world could never be viewed through ignorance again. The night was a school, the terror a curriculum, and he, the condemned, the humiliated, the observer, had been initiated. Fear transformed into perception, despair into strategy, horror into a lens for understanding. The awakened man stands apart, forever changed, aware that survival and mastery are not given. They are seized by those who can see the current shaping thought, desire, and action. and as the torches flickered across the grotesque scene, he felt the heavy, intoxicating weight of forbidden knowledge settle upon him. The lesson was brutal, undeniable, and irreversible. The structures we trust, the rules we obey, the love we cling to, all of it is malleable in the hands of those who understand the hidden forces of human behavior. To see it is dangerous, to ignore it is fatal. And in that perilous clarity, he understood that the journey had only just begun. The man's mind had become a razor, slicing through illusion and fear to perceive the hidden mechanisms orchestrating the night's horrors. He realized now that this grotesque display, the laughter of the slaves, the iron biting his flesh, the lifeless form of his wife, was only a fragment of a larger, almost cosmic system. Power, he understood, is never absolute. It is fluid, invisible, and always transferred to those who comprehend its unspoken rules. Every hierarchy, every institution, every supposed moral code is built upon these silent levers: the manipulation of perception, the control of fear, the exploitation of desire. And the slaves, liberated in appearance, were executing the lesson of centuries. Those who observe, adapt, and anticipate can wield authority over the seemingly powerful without ever striking a blow. The man saw, with bone-deep clarity, that love, loyalty, and morality are not shields. They are tools, symbols, and instruments, capable of being weaponized, displayed, and dissected to teach obedience or awaken comprehension. And yet, amid the horror, he felt a dangerous, intoxicating thrill, the awakening of insight that few ever achieve. Knowledge of these systems grants power, but it is a perilous gift. The awakened are mocked, isolated, forever separated from the blind, unable to unsee the patterns that shape every action, thought, and belief. He understood that society itself operates on this principle, that most men live in chains forged by expectation, tradition, and conditioned obedience, never perceiving the invisible currents that move them. But he had seen it, and seeing changes everything. The night was no longer mere terror. It was revelation, a masterclass in human behavior, a lesson in the orchestration of fear and desire. And as he felt the weight of his knowledge settle, he realized the cruelest truth of all. Awareness is both a weapon and a burden, liberation and damnation. Once a man recognizes the machinery of control, he cannot return to ignorance, cannot trust the illusions of morality, cannot cling to love or loyalty without understanding its potential for manipulation. The awakened man must navigate a world of hidden hierarchies, invisible chains, and relentless observation. And in that moment, surrounded by orchestrated cruelty and grotesque displays, the man knew that the night had transformed him irrevocably. He had glimpsed forbidden knowledge, and it would follow him forever, shaping his mind, his perception, and his destiny. Why now? The man could no longer separate terror from understanding. The two had merged into a single, burning clarity that seared through his mind. Every detail, the slave's laughter, the cold iron biting his wrists, the lifeless gaze of his wife, revealed the invisible architecture of domination that governs every corner of human society. He saw that obedience, fear, loyalty, and desire are not merely moral concepts. They are tools, levers, and weapons, employed by those who understand the hidden rules. The slaves were no longer just tormentors, they were teachers, demonstrating how power flows to those who comprehend, anticipate, and manipulate the unseen currents of influence. And the lesson extended far beyond this plantation, far beyond that night. Governments, corporations, religions, families, all operate on the same principle: control through subtlety, ritual, and perception. His wife's death, grotesque and deliberate, was a symbol, a statement, a ritualized lesson on how attachment and morality can be exploited to shape behavior and enforce obedience. Yet within this horror, a spark of dangerous comprehension ignited in him. Knowledge, even forbidden, is a weapon. Understanding the invisible patterns that shape thought, loyalty, and action transforms despair into agency, helplessness into strategy. But such awareness comes at a cost: isolation, the weight of truth, and the irreversible dissolution of illusion. The man realized that most people live blind, enslaved by forces they cannot name, shackled by invisible rules, never perceiving the currents that carry them. But he had seen it all, and the clarity both empowered and terrorized him. The night had become a lesson, a masterclass in the orchestration of fear, desire, and obedience, revealing the hidden mechanics that govern human behavior and society itself. And in that understanding lay a brutal paradox. Freedom and power come only through recognition, endurance, and navigation of the invisible systems that dominate life. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Once you comprehend them, your life is forever changed. And as the torches flickered against the faces of those who had once served him, now wielding influence through insight, he realized that he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer merely a victim. He had been initiated, marked by knowledge that could destroy or empower, and the path forward demanded mastery of what he now understood to be the most dangerous secret of all, the architecture of human control. The man's mind had become a lens, honed to perceive the invisible threads of control weaving through every action, every thought, every intention around him. The night's horror, the laughter of the slaves, the weight of the iron on his wrists, the lifeless body of his wife, was no longer random suffering. It was a demonstration, a masterful orchestration of obedience, fear, and perception. He understood, with bone-deep clarity, that power is not measured by strength or brutality alone, but by understanding the unspoken rules that govern human behavior, by anticipating the moves of those who do not even realize they are participating in the game. The slaves, once instruments of subservience, had become teachers of subtle domination, demonstrating how the seemingly powerless can seize authority by recognizing the patterns hidden in plain sight. And the lesson extended beyond this night, this place, this grotesque display. Every institution he had trusted, law, religion, family, society, operated on the same principles: manipulation, perception management, and the orchestration of obedience through ritual and invisible rules. His wife's death, once a source of private anguish, became a symbol of the malleability of attachment and morality when placed under the scrutiny of power. And yet, amid the terror, he felt a dangerous exhilaration, the awakening of insight that few ever achieve. Knowledge, especially forbidden knowledge, is a weapon, and to wield it requires endurance, detachment, and courage. He saw that most men live their lives blind, shackled by invisible forces, unaware of the levers that shape desire, loyalty, and thought. But he had glimpsed it, and once seen, the world could never be viewed the same way again. The night had become a classroom of forbidden understanding, and he, the condemned, the humiliated, the observer, had been initiated. Fear transformed into perception, despair into strategy, and horror into a lens for understanding the invisible currents shaping life. And he realized that to survive, to master, and to influence, a man must not only see these currents but learn to navigate them, to act within them with precision, subtlety, and unflinching awareness. For once the veil is lifted, ignorance is no longer an option, and the awakened are forever changed, marked by the dangerous clarity of forbidden truth. As the night pressed on, the man began to perceive the subtle orchestration behind every action, every glance, every flicker of torchlight. Nothing was accidental. The chaos, the laughter, the grotesque display of his wife's body were all deliberate, designed to teach a lesson he had not known he needed to learn. He understood now that power is rarely in brute force. It flows to those who comprehend the invisible structures guiding behavior, who can see the patterns that most men ignore, and who can manipulate perception, fear, and desire with precision. The slaves, once obedient instruments of his authority, were now teachers, demonstrating how knowledge of these hidden rules can invert power, turning the subservient into the dominant without striking a blow. His wife's death had become a symbol of the fragility of attachment, morality, and love when placed under the scrutiny of control, a lesson that transcended personal tragedy to reveal the universality of these principles. And within this grotesque revelation, a dangerous thrill coursed through him. Understanding the machinery of domination transforms terror into insight, helplessness into strategy, and observation into power. He realized that the very institutions men trust, family, religion, law, governments, operate on the same principles, concealing manipulation beneath rituals, morality, and comforting narratives. Most men remain blind, shackled by invisible chains, unaware of the forces that govern thought, loyalty, and action. But he had seen it. And once knowledge touches the mind, there is no returning to ignorance. Awareness isolates, yet it empowers. It terrifies, yet it arms. He understood now that survival and mastery do not belong to the strongest alone. They belong to those who see, anticipate, and manipulate the currents shaping human behavior. The night was not merely punishment. It was initiation, a brutal awakening into forbidden knowledge that few can endure. And as he processed the lessons of the torch's flickering light and the grotesque scene before him, he realized the terrifying, exhilarating truth. Once a man comprehends the architecture of control, he carries both a weapon and a burden, and the world will never feel the same again. The man's mind, now sharpened by horror and comprehension, began to trace the invisible hierarchies shaping the scene around him. Every glance, every whisper, every subtle shift in posture revealed a system older and more precise than any law or morality he had known. Power, he realized, is not merely about domination. It is about understanding the unseen currents that govern obedience, fear, and desire. The slaves, once instruments of subservience, had become teachers of perception, demonstrating how authority can be seized by those who observe and comprehend the hidden rules. His wife's death, brutal and symbolic, illustrated the fragility of attachment and morality when placed under the scrutiny of these forces, showing that love can be manipulated as easily as loyalty, weaponized as readily as fear. And yet, amid the terror, he felt a flicker of dangerous clarity, the intoxicating realization that knowledge, even forbidden, is a weapon, and that comprehension grants power beyond physical strength. The night itself had become a classroom, the grotesque spectacle a lesson in human behavior, and he, the condemned, the humiliated, the observer, had been initiated into truths that few survived to acknowledge. He saw that every institution, every system, every society operates under the same principles, invisible levers that shape perception, rituals that enforce obedience, and patterns that dictate behavior. Most men remain blind, shackled by unspoken rules and conditioned loyalty, unable to perceive the currents shaping their lives. But he had glimpsed the machinery, and with that insight came both isolation and power. Awareness is a dangerous gift. It cannot be unlearned, and once the veil is lifted, the world can never be trusted at face value. The awakened are forever changed, forced to navigate a landscape where morality, attachment, and loyalty are tools for manipulation, and survival depends on recognizing and mastering the invisible structures that govern thought and action. And in that horrifying, intoxicating clarity, he understood the ultimate lesson. To see the system is to inherit its burdens, and to wield its truths is to walk the knife's edge between mastery and ruin. The man's awareness now extended beyond the immediate horror into a vast, almost incomprehensible network of invisible forces that had always governed human behavior. Every gesture, every laugh, every shift of shadow around him was part of a coded system, a hidden curriculum designed to teach obedience, fear, and perception to those with the eyes to see. He understood, with chilling clarity, that power is never absolute. It flows to those who anticipate, who comprehend the unspoken rules, and who can manipulate perception and desire without detection. The slaves, once instruments of subservience, now embodied the principles of domination, demonstrating that the seemingly powerless can become the most dangerous when they awaken to the patterns hidden in plain sight. His wife's lifeless body, grotesque and symbolic, revealed how attachment, loyalty, and morality can be weaponized, displayed, and manipulated to enforce obedience or awaken insight. Amid the horror, a dangerous exhilaration coursed through him. Knowledge, even forbidden, grants agency, transforms despair into strategy, and horror into perception. He saw that every institution, families, religions, governments, corporations, functions on the same hidden rules, shaping loyalty, fear, and desire under the guise of law, tradition, or morality. Most men live blind, shackled by invisible chains they cannot see, bound by rituals and expectations they never question. But he had glimpsed the system, and once knowledge touches the mind, it cannot be undone. The awakening isolates as it empowers, it terrifies as it arms. Survival and mastery do not belong to the strong alone. They belong to those who perceive, anticipate, and navigate the hidden currents that govern life. The night was no longer punishment. It was initiation, an immersion into forbidden knowledge few survive. And as he absorbed the lessons of orchestrated cruelty and subtle domination, he realized a terrifying truth. Understanding the architecture of control gives a man the power to influence, survive, and dominate. But it also marks him forever, separating the awakened from the blind, the informed from the obedient, and the master from the pawn. By this point, the man's mind had become a crucible, forging clarity from horror and insight from despair. Every detail, the slave's laughter, the iron biting his wrists, the lifeless gaze of his wife, revealed the intricate architecture of human control that had always operated just beyond perception. He understood now that power is not merely brute strength or authority. It resides in those who see the patterns, read the signals, and anticipate the movements of others, bending fear, loyalty, and desire to their will without ever needing to strike. The slaves, once subservient, had become instructors in this unspoken art, demonstrating how the seemingly powerless can seize influence when they awaken to the hidden rules. And in that grotesque, horrifying theater, he recognized a universal truth: attachment, morality, and love are not safeguards, they are instruments, manipulable and exploitable by those who understand the machinery behind human behavior. Within this brutal revelation stirred a dangerous exhilaration, a realization that forbidden knowledge is not merely information, it is a weapon. To grasp it is to be marked. To wield it is to accept both power and the isolation that accompanies awareness. The night's horrors extended far beyond the plantation, revealing the hidden currents governing institutions, governments, religions, and societies, invisible levers shaping perception, rituals enforcing obedience, and subtle signals guiding thought and behavior. Most men remain blind, trapped in invisible chains, never noticing the forces that shaped their lives. But he had seen. And seeing changes everything. Awareness isolates, terrifies, and empowers. The awakened man knows the rules, understands the currents, and can navigate them with precision. But he can never unsee the patterns, never return to ignorance, never trust appearances. The night, once punishment, had become initiation. Fear had become perception. Despair had become strategy. Horror had become insight. And in the suffocating clarity of that revelation, he understood the ultimate paradox. The very knowledge that grants power also demands sacrifice, marking him forever as one who sees, one who understands, and one who must walk the razor's edge between mastery and ruin. The man's perception had sharpened to a painful acuity, revealing the invisible threads that bound every thought, every action, every flicker of fear around him. He saw that the night's horror, the laughter of the slaves, the iron cutting into his wrists, the lifeless corpse of his wife, was not chaos but instruction, a carefully orchestrated lesson in the mechanics of domination, obedience, and perception. Power, he realized, is not seized by strength alone. It is claimed by those who understand the hidden currents, anticipate the unseen moves, and manipulate the fears and desires of others with subtle precision. The slaves, once instruments of his authority, had become the teachers of an ancient, unspoken curriculum, showing how those who appear powerless can become dominant when they recognize the rules invisible to most. His wife's death, grotesque and deliberate, became a symbol of how attachment, loyalty, and morality can be dissected, weaponized, and displayed to enforce obedience or awaken understanding. And in that terrifying clarity, a dangerous exhilaration surged through him. Knowledge, forbidden and visceral, is power, and comprehension transforms despair into strategy, helplessness into influence, and terror into insight. He understood that this principle extended far beyond the plantation. Institutions, governments, religions, societies, all operate on these hidden levers, shaping loyalty, fear, and desire while concealing the mechanisms behind rituals, tradition, and morality. Most men remain blind, shackled by invisible rules, incapable of perceiving the currents that govern their lives. But he had seen, and once knowledge touches the mind, it can never be removed. Awareness isolates as it empowers, it terrifies as it arms. The awakened are mocked, forever separated from the blind, forced to navigate a world where morality, attachment, and obedience can be tools of control. Survival and mastery belong only to those who recognize the patterns, anticipate the shifts, and act with the precision of one who understands the machinery beneath the facade. And in that suffocating, intoxicating clarity, he grasped a truth that would follow him forever. Once a man sees the system, he cannot return to ignorance, and the knowledge he now carries can either make him unstoppable or destroy him entirely. The man's mind had become a vessel for perception, every nerve alert to the invisible currents shaping the grotesque scene around him. He saw now that the laughter of the slaves, the cold iron on his wrists, the lifeless body of his wife, everything, was part of a meticulous design, a curriculum of domination written in shadows and gestures, in fear and anticipation. Power, he realized, is not in force or brutality alone. It resides in the comprehension of unspoken rules, in the ability to read patterns invisible to those who merely obey. The slaves, once instruments of his authority, were now masters of subtlety, demonstrating how knowledge of hidden systems can invert power, how the seemingly weak can become dominant when they perceive the mechanics of control. His wife's death, grotesque and symbolic, revealed the terrifying malleability of attachment, loyalty, and morality, demonstrating that love and obedience are instruments in the hands of those who understand the architecture of influence. Amid the horror, he felt a dangerous exhilaration. Comprehension itself is power, and forbidden knowledge is a weapon. Understanding transforms despair into strategy, fear into perception, helplessness into agency. He recognized that the same principles govern every institution, families, religions, governments, societies, all manipulating perception, desire, and fear beneath comforting facades of law, morality, and ritual. Most men remain blind, shackled by invisible chains, unaware of the forces that move them. But he had seen it, and the world could never be viewed the same way again. Awareness isolates, terrifies, and arms. The awakened are mocked, forced to navigate life with a clarity that separates them from the blind, the obedient, the controlled. Survival and mastery belong only to those who anticipate, perceive, and act within the invisible currents shaping behavior. And in that moment, surrounded by orchestrated cruelty and grotesque display, he understood the ultimate lesson. The architecture of human control is everywhere, and once a man sees it, he carries both a weapon and a burden, and the path forward will demand every ounce of cunning, observation, and unflinching will he possesses. The man's mind had entered a new dimension of clarity, where horror and understanding fused into a relentless awareness of the invisible systems shaping every interaction. The torches cast flickering shadows, but the real illumination was internal. He saw the architecture of control that had governed the plantation, his wife, the slaves, and himself, a network of invisible levers manipulating loyalty, fear, and desire with precision beyond cruelty. He realized now that the slaves, empowered through comprehension of these unspoken rules, were no longer merely participants. They were instructors, demonstrating how subtlety, observation, and anticipation convert weakness into authority. His wife's death, grotesque and deliberate, was a symbol of the ultimate lesson. Attachment, morality, and love are instruments, capable of being wielded to enforce obedience or awaken forbidden insight. And in that grim revelation, exhilaration mingled with despair. Knowledge, even forbidden, is a weapon, but it carries isolation, burden, and irreversible transformation. He saw that this pattern extended far beyond the plantation, touching every institution and hierarchy. Governments, religions, corporations, families, all functioning through hidden codes, rituals, and manipulations that shape thought, action, and loyalty while masking the mechanisms beneath comfort, tradition, and morality. Most men remain blind, shackled by invisible chains they cannot perceive, unaware of the forces directing their choices. But he had glimpsed the machinery, and that awareness, once acquired, cannot be erased. Survival, mastery, and influence belong only to those who perceive the currents, anticipate their shifts, and act with precision within them. And as he absorbed this, a dangerous truth settled in. Understanding the system transforms the observer, marking him as awakened, separating him from the blind, and demanding that he navigate life with unflinching perception. Once a man sees the invisible architecture of control, he carries both a weapon and a curse. He can never return to ignorance, and every step forward will test the boundaries of courage, insight, and restraint. The night had become an initiation, brutal, precise, and transformative, and he understood that the lessons were only beginning. The man's mind now functioned like a lens, penetrating layers of illusion to perceive the currents of control that had been shaping every moment around him. He saw that the laughter of the slaves, the cold iron biting his wrists, the lifeless body of his wife, and even the flickering torchlight were all components of a carefully constructed system designed to teach, punish, and awaken simultaneously. Power, he realized, is not brute strength but comprehension, the ability to anticipate, manipulate, and navigate the invisible rules that govern perception, fear, and desire. The slaves, once instruments of his authority, had become instructors in subtle domination, showing how knowledge of hidden patterns transforms weakness into dominance without a single overt strike. His wife's death, grotesque and symbolic, illustrated the ultimate truth. Attachment, love, and morality are not shields. They are tools that can be weaponized, dissected, and displayed to enforce obedience or awaken insight. And within this horrifying clarity, a dangerous exhilaration surged. Forbidden knowledge is a weapon, and understanding it converts despair into strategy, helplessness into agency, and terror into insight. He realized that these principles were universal, governing every institution, every hierarchy, every society that claims morality, law, or tradition as a facade, concealing manipulation beneath ritual, expectation, and subtle reward or punishment. Most men remain blind, shackled by invisible chains, unable to perceive the currents that direct their lives. But he had seen it, and once perceived, this knowledge cannot be unlearned. Awareness isolates as it empowers, it terrifies as it arms. The awakened are forever changed, navigating a world where morality, attachment, and loyalty are instruments, and survival depends on recognizing and mastering the invisible forces behind every human action. And as he absorbed the full weight of this revelation, he understood the terrifying, exhilarating paradox. Comprehension grants power, but it also marks the observer, forever separating him from the blind, the obedient, and the controlled. The man's awareness had become a blade, cutting through the comforting illusions that had governed his life, revealing the skeletal mechanics of control hidden beneath every interaction. The night's grotesque theater, the laughter of the slaves, the iron biting his flesh, the lifeless body of his wife, was no longer simply horror. It was a curriculum in domination, obedience, and perception, meticulously constructed to awaken insight in those capable of seeing. Power, he understood, is not force. It is comprehension, anticipation, and the ability to manipulate invisible currents that govern faith, loyalty, and desire. The slaves, once his subordinates, now demonstrated mastery, revealing how the seemingly weak ascend when they perceive the hidden rules others ignore. His wife's death had become more than personal tragedy. It was a lesson in attachment, morality, and love as tools, showing how even the most sacred bonds can be dissected, weaponized, and displayed to enforce obedience or spark comprehension. Amid the horror, exhilaration surged. Forbidden knowledge is a weapon, and its comprehension transforms despair into strategy, terror into perception, and helplessness into agency. He recognized that the principles displayed here were universal. Governments, religions, families, and societies operate on the same hidden levers, shaping thought, action, and loyalty beneath facades of tradition, law, and morality. Most men remain blind, shackled by invisible chains, incapable of seeing the forces that guide their lives. But he had seen. And once knowledge touches the mind, it cannot be removed. Awareness isolates, empowers, and terrifies. The awakened are forever separated from the blind, navigating a world where morality, attachment, and obedience are tools, and survival demands mastery of the invisible architecture behind every human action. In that suffocating clarity, he understood the ultimate paradox. Knowledge grants power, but it also burdens the observer, marking him forever, forcing him to see, understand, and navigate a world that will never again appear safe, moral, or predictable. The man's mind had become a radar, tuned to detect every subtle shift in behavior, every unspoken rule, every invisible force operating behind the facade of the plantation, the night, and the lives around him. He saw that the spectacle, the laughter of the slaves, the iron cutting into his wrists, the corpse of his wife, was not chaos but a precise system, an unspoken curriculum in the mechanics of power, perception, and obedience. Power, he realized, does not belong to the loudest, the strongest, or the most violent. It belongs to those who perceive the hidden currents, anticipate the unspoken signals, and manipulate fear, desire, and loyalty with precision. The slaves, once instruments of his authority, now demonstrated the ultimate lesson. Knowledge of the invisible rules transforms weakness into dominance, teaching that authority is a perception, a manipulation of reality that can be wielded without striking a blow. His wife's death, grotesque and symbolic, revealed the terrifying truth that attachment, morality, and love can all be exploited, weaponized, and displayed to enforce obedience or spark insight. And in that terrifying comprehension, a dangerous exhilaration surged. Forbidden knowledge is not merely observation. It is power, a force that transforms despair into strategy, helplessness into mastery, and horror into perception. He recognized that this system extends beyond the plantation, encompassing governments, religions, corporations, and social hierarchies, all structured with invisible levers and rituals to manipulate, condition, and control. Most men remain blind, shackled by chains they cannot see, unaware of the forces directing their lives. But he had glimpsed the machinery, and that awareness cannot be erased. Knowledge isolates, terrifies, and empowers. The awakened are forever marked, navigating a world where morality, attachment, and loyalty are instruments, and survival requires mastery of the hidden currents shaping every human action. And as he absorbed the depth of this truth, he understood the paradox that will follow him for life. Insight grants power, but with power comes the burden of seeing what others cannot, navigating a world of manipulation, and acting with precision in a system that punishes the unaware mercilessly. The man's consciousness had become a scalpel, slicing through every illusion, every comforting narrative, to reveal the hidden structures controlling every human action around him. The grotesque scene, the slave's laughter, the iron biting into his flesh, the corpse of his wife, was no longer just horror. It was a masterclass in the mechanics of domination, obedience, and perception, meticulously designed to awaken those capable of seeing. He understood, with a terrifying clarity, that power does not reside in brute strength alone. It is claimed by those who perceive the invisible rules, anticipate every subtle shift, and manipulate fear, loyalty, and desire with precision. The slaves, once his subordinates, now demonstrated mastery, teaching that authority can be seized by understanding patterns invisible to the uninitiated. His wife's death had become more than a personal tragedy. It was a symbol of how attachment, morality, and love can be weaponized, dissected, and displayed to enforce obedience or ignite comprehension. Within this grim revelation, exhilaration surged. Forbidden knowledge is a weapon, and comprehension transforms despair into strategy, terror into insight, helplessness into agency. He saw that these principles govern every system: families, governments, religions, corporations, structures that manipulate perception and behavior through invisible levers, rituals, and expectation. Most men remain blind, shackled by forces they cannot see, ignorant of the currents that guide their choices. But he had glimpsed the machinery, and the knowledge now coursing through him could not be erased. Awareness isolates as it empowers, it terrifies as it arms. The awakened are forever changed, navigating a world where morality, attachment, and obedience are tools, and survival requires mastery of the unseen forces shaping every action. And in the suffocating clarity of that night, he realized the ultimate paradox. Insight grants unparalleled power. Yet with that power comes the irreversible burden of seeing the hidden architecture of control, forever separating the awakened from the blind, the informed from the obedient, and the master from the pawn. The man's mind had reached a state of relentless acuity, seeing the invisible scaffolding behind every gesture, every glance, every flicker of movement around him. The grotesque tableau, the slave's laughter, the iron biting his wrists, the lifeless body of his wife, was no longer mere cruelty. It was revelation, an intricate demonstration of control, hierarchy, and perception, designed for those who could perceive its lessons. He realized, with bone-deep clarity, that power is not taken with force. It is seized by those who understand the hidden rules, anticipate the unspoken signals, and manipulate fear, desire, and loyalty with surgical precision. The slaves, once his subordinates, had become instructors, showing how knowledge of unseen patterns transforms weakness into dominance, teaching that authority is a perception, a strategy, a manipulation of reality itself. His wife's death, grotesque and symbolic, illuminated a cruel truth. Attachment, love, and morality can be weaponized, dissected, and displayed to enforce obedience or awaken forbidden comprehension. And amid this terror, a dangerous exhilaration surged. Knowledge is a weapon, and forbidden understanding converts despair into strategy, helplessness into agency, and horror into perception. He recognized that this system is universal. Families, governments, religions, corporations, all operate through hidden levers, shaping thought, behavior, and loyalty while concealing their mechanics beneath rituals, tradition, and moral posturing. Most men remain blind, chained by invisible rules, unaware of the forces that move them. But he had seen it, and seeing changes everything. Awareness isolates as it empowers, It terrifies as it arms. The awakened are forever marked, navigating a world where morality, attachment, and loyalty are instruments, and survival belongs to those who perceive, anticipate, and act with precision. And in that moment, suffused with the intoxicating clarity of forbidden truth, he realized the ultimate paradox. Comprehension grants power, but it also burdens the observer, separating him irreversibly from the blind, the obedient, and the controlled, forcing him to navigate a world of invisible rules with unflinching awareness or face destruction. The man's mind had become a lens of lethal clarity, perceiving the currents of control and manipulation that guided every action around him. He saw that the night's horrors, the slave's laughter, the iron biting into his wrists, the lifeless body of his wife, were not chaotic, but deliberate, a curriculum designed to teach the architecture of power, obedience, and perception to those capable of comprehension. Power, he realized, is never absolute. It flows to those who understand invisible rules, anticipate the unspoken signals, and manipulate faith, loyalty, and desire without detection. The slaves, once instruments of his authority, now embodied mastery, demonstrating how those who perceive the patterns invisible to most can seize dominance without overt force. His wife's death, grotesque and symbolic, revealed that attachment, morality, and love are not shields. They are tools, capable of being weaponized, dissected, and displayed to enforce obedience or awaken insight. And within this grim clarity, exhilaration surged. Forbidden knowledge is a weapon, and understanding it transforms despair into strategy, helplessness into agency, and terror into perception. He recognized that these principles govern every structure: families, governments, religions, corporations, all manipulating loyalty, faith, and desire through invisible levers, rituals, and expectation, masking control beneath facades of tradition, law, and morality. Most men remain blind, shackled by forces they cannot see, unaware of the currents that shape their lives. But he had glimpsed the machinery, and that knowledge could never be erased. Awareness isolates as it empowers, it terrifies as it arms. The awakened are forever changed, forced to navigate a world where morality, attachment, and obedience are instruments, and survival demands mastery of the invisible currents shaping human behavior. And in that suffocating, intoxicating clarity, he grasped the ultimate paradox. Comprehension grants power, but it also marks the observer, separating him irreversibly from the blind, the obedient, and the controlled, and demanding unflinching mastery of a world few ever truly perceived or be. Why now? The man's mind had become a weapon, honed to detect every subtle shift, every hidden signal, every invisible lever that governed the grotesque world around him. The night's horrors, the laughter of the slaves, the iron cutting into his flesh, the lifeless body of his wife, were no longer random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate, precise, and instructive, revealing the underlying rules of power, fear, and perception. He understood that dominance is not seized through force alone. It is claimed by those who comprehend the hidden currents, anticipate moves before they are made, and manipulate desire, loyalty, and terror with surgical precision. The slaves, once obedient tools, had become masters of subtlety, showing that authority is perception, a strategy, a manipulation of reality itself. His wife's death, grotesque and symbolic, laid bare the cruel truth. Attachment, morality, and love are instruments, capable of being weaponized to enforce obedience or awaken forbidden understanding. Within this realization surged a dangerous exhilaration. Knowledge, even forbidden, is power, and comprehension transforms despair into strategy, terror into insight, and helplessness into agency. He recognized that the same architecture governs every institution: families, governments, religions, corporations, hidden levers shaping thought, action, and loyalty while masked beneath ritual, law, and moral posturing. Most men remain blind, shackled by invisible chains they cannot perceive, unaware of the forces directing their lives. But he had seen, and once knowledge touches the mind, it cannot be erased. Awareness isolates as it empowers, it terrifies as it arms. The awakened are forever changed, navigating a world where morality, attachment, and obedience are tools, and survival depends on mastering the invisible structures controlling every human action. And in the suffocating clarity of that night, he understood the ultimate paradox. Insight grants unmatched power, but it also carries the burden of seeing what others cannot, separating him irrevocably from the blind, the obedient, and the controlled, forcing him to navigate life with unflinching precision, cunning, and awareness, or perished at last. The man understood the full, terrifying architecture of the night, the laughter, the chains, the corpse of his wife, the shifting eyes of the slaves, all pieces of a system older and more precise than any law, ritual, or moral code. Power, he realized, is never about brute force. It belongs to those who see, who anticipate, who manipulate invisible currents with clarity and precision. The slaves, once instruments of obedience, had become masters of perception, demonstrating that knowledge of hidden rules transforms weakness into dominance, and that authority is ultimately a construct, a perception, a strategy wielded by the aware. His wife's death, grotesque and symbolic, revealed the cruel truth. Attachment, loyalty, and love are not shields, they are instruments, capable of manipulation, display, and weaponization to enforce obedience or awaken forbidden insight. And as this comprehension settled into his bones, a dangerous exhilaration surged. Knowledge is not passive. It is power. It is strategy. It is a weapon. He saw that this same system governs every hierarchy, every society, every institution, where loyalty, desire, and fear are manipulated through invisible levers, rituals, and coded signals, all masked beneath law, tradition, and morality. Most men live blind, shackled by forces they cannot perceive, unaware of the currents controlling their lives. But he had glimpsed it, and the knowledge would follow him forever. Awareness isolates even as it empowers. It terrifies even as it arms. The awakened are forever separated from the blind, forced to navigate a world of manipulation, deception, and hidden power, surviving only by mastering the invisible architecture shaping every human action. And in that suffocating, intoxicating clarity, he understood the ultimate, final truth. Once a man sees the machinery of control, he cannot unsee it. Once he understands, he cannot ignore it. He carries both the weapon and the burden, the gift and the curse, the clarity and the danger. And now, having been forged in the crucible of horror and comprehension, he steps forward into a world forever altered, armed with the forbidden knowledge that changes everything, and marks him as one who can never return to innocence, trust, or ignorance.